Hello again, everyone. My name is Jeff, otherwise known as the Economic Prepper, and I'm here today to talk about one of our favorite topics, the Federal Reserve. Now, I'm not going to get into all the history. I've done that lots of times. Check out my older videos if you want to see that. But I'm going to talk about the Federal Reserve, its position in the economy, and Trump's new financial world under his administration, how it's going to be handled, how things are going, and how it ends. And what are the steps in between? Because you can't just snap your fingers and have it closed overnight. So, let me start by laying it out. So first off, the Federal Reserve. You know it's not federal. You know there's no reserves. It is not. It is the original NGO. Okay? It is a non-government organization that is considered to be government, but it's not. Okay? It's the central bank of private banks for the United States. It's basically the world central bank for the most part, except if you don't count the Bank of International Settlements and all that level. The main thing is about the Federal Reserve is that they're basically irrelevant right now. Why do I say that? Now, everybody's looking at what they're going to do. I think it's this week that are they going to cut rates? Are they not? Is Chairman Powell going to get fired? All that is topics of conversation. What matters today is where is the dollar heading, where is the economy heading, and where is the Federal Reserve in that whole big picture. So first of all, we want this thing. Give me a copy of it. All right. We want this debt instrument to go away. We want this gone. Why? Because it's a Federal Reserve note. It is a debt instrument, meaning that when the government spends, which is the biggest spender of these things, they borrow them from the Federal Reserve and they owe interest back to the Federal Reserve. So how do we get out of that situation? How do we not borrow dollars from the Federal Reserve? I've talked in the past about how stable coins will allow the Treasury to sell bonds or dollars directly to end users, most likely out of country because they want dollars versus their local currency. That's one method. The other method is that the Treasury is selling bills instead of bonds and treasuries. They're shorter term products, and that's how they raise capital. That's the two ways I see them raising capital. There are other tricks that they have in their bag to raise capital rather than borrowing dollars from the Federal Reserve, because every one of these you borrow from the Federal Reserve, you owe at least this much back, and that's part of the problem. Now, there's an important number that just came out recently. I think Scott Bissett talked about this over the weekend, and he said that even though our debt, our federal deficit or the national debt is like 36 trillion now, even though it's gone up 2-3 trillion last year, in the same period, we actually just paid less interest than last year. So let's just say the numbers 33 and 36 trillion for simple. So 36 trillion is our national debt. That's how much we owe bondholders, treasury holders. That's what our number is today, 36 trillion. A year ago it was 33. We paid a certain amount of interest on that 33 trillion last year to service that debt. Even though the number went up from 33 to 36 trillion, we paid less interest. How is that possible? Even when interest rates are creeping up, we've seen the 10-year go up, we've seen everything else go up. All interest rates on 10-year notes and instruments like that are going up. So how are we paying less? Well, we're having investors into the country, and we're also selling bills rather than treasuries, which are lower interest to raise more capital. And also the External Revenue Service. All these different things are constructing together, so we have to pay. So we get away with paying less interest on that debt. So even though we're barreling forward to probably a bankruptcy eventually if we keep this up, we slow down that rate. We slow down the interest. We've slowed down the inflation. We've slowed down the tacking on of interest to our budget, which is way too high. So we're getting there, but it's obviously not the end goal. So how do we get to the point where we don't need any more of these anymore? That's the problem, is that to run the government, you need more of these to spend. So how do we not need more of these? And what is the end game? Well, I talked to you about how we get there. All right, we sell treasuries directly to people. We sell with lower interest. We sell bills. And when these treasuries are created, there's an auction. Now, there's been lots of talk about the auctions aren't going well. The treasury's buying their own I'm sorry, the Federal Reserve is buying their own debt. They're buying treasuries. They are the buyer of last resort. What that means is they buy when no one else will buy. So that's just to keep the machine running. Now, eventually they hope that they'll sell these, but what if they don't? That is the end game, and that is where Trump really comes into play, because if there's anybody that has experience in running companies through bankruptcy, it's Trump. He's done it several times. He's going to run the Federal Reserve through the bankruptcy. And how we get there is that more and more of the debt that is owed to investors through these treasuries are going to wind up with the buyer of last resort. In other words, the Federal Reserve is going to eventually be the owner of all these debt instruments. So this debt instrument will eventually be owed to the Federal Reserve, and then there's only one step in the process, which is to eliminate and bankrupt the Federal Reserve. Now, introducing another currency that's asset-backed and investing in our country and getting the External Revenue Service and getting investment into the United States and selling treasuries directly so we don't borrow from the Federal Reserve. We're trying to go, rather than, the Federal Reserve is essentially meaningless now because the machine is so big. The financial system is so big. We saw this last September before Trump even took office. There was a rate cut of 50 basis points, that's 0.5%, and there was another one before Trump took office. What happened during that time? Instead of the interest rate cut by the Federal Reserve going down, it did go down. So they cut their rates, but 10-year notes, which directly relate to mortgages, went up. So instead of the rate cut lowering mortgage rates, they went the opposite way. Why? It's still seen as a risky investment because they want more return on their dollars because they see the risk over the next 10-year period as being higher than it was before because the debt's higher. They don't see the mechanism just yet. So the Federal Reserve they've lost relevancy. They've lost their influence. They've lost their ability to make or change or influence rates and markets. That's part of the reason why they're not making cuts now. And part of the reason is that they don't really know what to do. They only have one lever to pull, which is to cut rates. They could do some quantitative easing and quantitative tightening to deal with the liquidity. So it's QT or QE, tightening or easing. That just determines how much they're going to buy or how much they're going to sell. So they get more liquidity in the market, get more money moving, getting banks to create mortgages. We'll talk about in a future video. But for right now, the issue is that you've got the buyer of last resort is going to wind up with all the debt. So one way that this all ends is by having the buyer of last resort buying everything, and then the U.S. not even being a buyer of dollars anymore. So they lose on both ends. The Federal Reserve lose on both ends. They lose on the ability to sell dollars to the U.S. They lose the ability to sell, or they wind up losing with treasuries because they have to buy the treasuries and bonds, and that's how they got paid in the first place. And if the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, gets ended in the next couple of years, which is highly likely, I would say, then there's another mechanism that they're not going to get paid back. So the Federal Reserve is losing the ability to gain wealth, scrape off the top, and run this financial system because there's no longer in control. So again, what's going to happen is that the Federal Reserve is going to be saddled with all their debt, and then they're going to go bankrupt, and then no one, this reserve note is owed to the Federal Reserve. So if the Federal Reserve goes bankrupt, then these are essentially dead, and we will have another currency by then. So what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about this? Do you see the buyer last resort getting stuck when the music stops and that's how it all ends? I'd love to know more of what you think, and I'll read every comment, so I will see you in the next video. Take care.